They called it a safe house for fallen women, a place where the forgotten could start again. But behind the velvet curtains and locked doors of the Everhart estate, something far darker was unfolding. Between 1898 and 1911, over 70 women walked through those doors seeking salvation. Not one of them walked out alive. The Everhart sisters ran the most successful brothel in Philadelphia's underworld, but success wasn't measured in money. It was measured in bodies, in silence, in secrets buried so deep that even today most people have never heard their names. This isn't just a story about murder. It's about a system that created the perfect conditions for predators to thrive. It's about how society builds the cages, then pretends not to see who's locked inside. What you're about to hear will disturb you not because it's graphic, but because it reveals how little has changed. The Everhart sisters understood something most people refuse to accept. Power isn't taken, it's given by those who look away. Lila and Margot Everhart weren't born into wealth. They were born into survival. Daughters of a Pittsburgh factory worker who drank himself to death, they learned early that the world doesn't save women, it consumes them. By 18, Lila was working the streets. By 20, she was managing other girls. By 25, she owned the house. Margot was the strategist, the one who understood that real power doesn't come from selling bodies, it comes from controlling the narrative. They didn't just run a brothel. They built an empire on the backs of society's most vulnerable, then turned that empire into a graveyard. What made them different wasn't their cruelty. Plenty of people are cruel. What made them dangerous was their understanding of human nature, of desperation, of how easily people disappear when no one is looking for them. They knew that in a world designed to forget certain women, murder could be invisible. They knew that poverty creates a special kind of blindness in society, and they weaponized that knowledge with surgical precision. The house stood on Locust Street, 3 stories of red brick and black iron gates. From the outside, it looked like any other upper-class residence. Inside, it was a machine designed for exploitation. The first floor was public, where politicians and businessmen came to drink and negotiate. The second floor was where the transactions happened, where flesh became currency. The third floor was where women went to disappear. Most brothels of the era operated in moral gray zones, exploitative but not explicitly murderous. The Everhart operation was different. It wasn't just a business, it was a cult of control. New girls were promised safety, wages, protection from the streets. What they got was laudanum-laced wine, locked doors, and a slow descent into dependency. The sisters understood addiction better than most doctors of their time. They understood that once you control someone's access to relief from pain, you control everything. They didn't need chains. They had chemistry. They had psychology. They had a system that turned hope into handcuffs. The pattern was always the same. A woman would arrive, usually brought by one of the sisters' recruiters who prowled train stations and poorhouses. She'd be given a room, a bath, a hot meal. The first week was designed to build trust, to make her feel like she'd finally found sanctuary. The second week, the work began. At first, it seemed like standard brothel operation, uncomfortable but survivable. But then came the debts. Fabricated expenses for room and board, for the dresses they made her wear, for the medicine they said she needed. Within a month, every girl owed more than she could ever repay. This wasn't accidental. This was architecture. Financial captivity designed to replace physical chains. The Everhart sisters had studied how company towns worked, how debt peonage functioned in the South. They applied those same principles to their operation. Once a woman was in debt, she couldn't leave. And once she couldn't leave, she became property. Property that could be used, abused, and eventually disposed of when it lost its value. But why murder? Why not just exploit them until they aged out or escaped? The answer reveals something darker about the business model. Dead women don't talk. Dead women don't go to police. Dead women don't write letters home or show up pregnant or develop enough anger to become dangerous. The sisters had calculated that there was a point in every woman's captivity where she became more liability than asset. When the laudanum addiction was too severe. When the violence had marked her too visibly. When she started asking too many questions or trying to organize the other girls. That's when she'd be taken to the third floor. That's when she'd receive the final dose of poison, the one that looked like an overdose, the one that let the sisters call in their paid-off coroner to sign a death certificate listing natural causes. The bodies were buried in a private cemetery the sisters owned through a shell company. The graves were unmarked. The deaths were unreported to any family. This is where the story gets darker because this wasn't just murder, it was industrialized death. The Everhart sisters had turned killing into a system, complete with logistics, timing, and bureaucratic cover. They had relationships with undertakers who asked no questions. They had clerks who filed paperwork without reading it. They had police officers who were regular customers, men who saw the operation as a service provider, not a crime scene. This is what institutionalized evil looks like. It doesn't announce itself with monsters and screaming. It announces itself with paperwork and routine. With men in suits who look the other way because looking would complicate their pleasures. The Everhart murders happened in plain sight of dozens of powerful people who could have stopped it at any moment. But stopping it would have required acknowledging that they were complicit. It would have required admitting that their entertainment was built on suffering. So they didn't look. They didn't ask. They didn't care. And 70 women died because silence is always the first accomplice to atrocity. The sisters operated with impunity for 13 years. 13 years of recruitment, exploitation, murder, and disposal. How does something like this continue for over a decade without intervention? The answer is as simple as it is disturbing, because the victims were already considered disposable. Poor women. Immigrant women. Women with no families or families that couldn't afford to search for them. Women who'd been working the streets before the sisters found them. In the moral calculus of 1900s America, these women didn't count. Their deaths didn't register as tragedies, they registered as statistics if they registered at all. This wasn't unique to the Everhart operation. This was standard protocol for how society has always treated its most vulnerable. The sisters simply recognized the pattern and exploited it. They understood that certain lives are considered expendable by the systems that claim to protect everyone equally. They understood that justice is rationed based on social class, race, and gender. And they built an empire on that understanding. Let's talk about the psychology of the sisters themselves, because dismissing them as simply evil misses the point. Lila Everhart wasn't a sadist who enjoyed killing. She was a businesswoman who saw murder as necessary loss prevention. Margot wasn't a psychopath who felt nothing. She was a strategist who'd learned to compartmentalize violence as operational necessity. They'd both been victims of the same system they now weaponized. They'd both been exploited, abused, discarded by men who saw them as objects. The difference is they decided to become the exploiters instead of dying as the exploited. This doesn't excuse what they did. It explains it. And explanation is more dangerous than condemnation, because explanation forces us to look at the conditions that create monsters. The Everhart sisters were produced by a society that gave women almost no path to power except through the manipulation of men. They chose the darkest possible version of that path. They became predators in a system designed to make them prey. The murders followed a pattern that revealed the sisters' cold efficiency. When a woman was selected for elimination, she'd be told she was being promoted to private client service. She'd be moved to the third floor, away from the other women. This isolation was crucial. It prevented witnesses, prevented organizing, prevented anyone from noticing the pattern. On the third floor, she'd be given increasingly strong doses of laudanum mixed with arsenic. The dosing was gradual enough that it mimicked the deterioration common among addicts and sick workers. By the time she died, usually within a week, her death looked like the inevitable conclusion of a hard life. The body would be removed at night, taken to the private cemetery, and buried before dawn. The other women in the house would be told she'd been moved to another location or that she'd run away. Some of them suspected the truth. None of them could prove it. And all of them were too trapped to investigate. This is how mass murder happens in civilized society. Quietly. Methodically. With institutional cooperation. The sisters maintained detailed records, which is how we know the true scope of their crimes. Ledgers found after their arrest showed entries for each woman. Name, date of arrival, income generated, date of disposal. They cataloged human beings like inventory in a warehouse. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was accounting. This was the language of capitalism applied to human life. Each woman was an asset with a life cycle. Recruitment, productivity peak, decline, and retirement. Except retirement meant murder. The ledgers showed that the average woman survived 14 months in the Everhart house. 14 months from arrival to burial. The most profitable women lasted longer. The least compliant were disposed of faster. The sisters had optimized their operation with the same efficiency that Carnegie was bringing to steel production and Rockefeller was bringing to oil. They were pioneers of their own dark industry, applying modern business principles to ancient exploitation. And they were successful by every metric except morality, which is precisely the problem with systems that measure success only in profit. Now we need to talk about the customers because they're as guilty as the murderers. The Everhart brothel wasn't servicing drifters and criminals. It was servicing Philadelphia's elite. City councilmen, judges, police captains, businessmen whose names appeared in newspapers as pillars of the community. These men knew something was wrong. They saw the haunted faces. They heard the locked doors on the third floor. They noticed that girls they'd seen 1 month were gone the next. But they didn't ask questions because asking questions would have ended their access. This is the banality of evil that everyone misses. It's not dramatic. It's not movie villain obvious. It's just men making small decisions to ignore obvious warning signs because those signs would complicate their pleasure. Every man who walked through those doors and chose not to see was complicit in murder. Every politician who took payment to look the other way was an accessory to genocide. The Everhart sisters pulled the trigger, but dozens of powerful men loaded the gun and handed it to them. The system protected itself through a network of mutually assured corruption. The police captain who patronized the house couldn't investigate without exposing himself. The judge who enjoyed the sisters' hospitality couldn't prosecute without implicating his colleagues. The politician who'd accepted bribes couldn't call for reform without triggering his own downfall. Everyone was dirty. Everyone had something to lose. So everyone stayed silent. This is how institutional evil perpetuates itself. Not through grand conspiracies or shadowy cabals, but through the simple mathematics of shared guilt. When everyone has blood on their hands, no one can afford to start washing. The Everhart sisters understood this perfectly. They didn't just run a brothel, they ran a blackmail operation disguised as a brothel. Every customer was a potential liability who became an asset the moment he crossed their threshold. They collected secrets like other people collected stamps. And those secrets became armor that made them nearly untouchable. For 13 years that armor held. Until one person decided that truth mattered more than self-preservation. Her name was Catherine Walsh, and she was 19 years old when she walked into the Everhart house in 1910. She'd been a seamstress who lost her job when the factory closed. No family. No prospects. The perfect victim. But Catherine had something the sisters hadn't accounted for. A photographic memory and basic literacy. While other women descended into addiction and despair, Catherine stayed alert. She watched. She listened. She memorized names, dates, faces. She noticed when girls disappeared. She noticed the patterns. And she started keeping a mental record of everything she witnessed. When she realized what was happening, she made a decision that should have gotten her killed. She decided to survive long enough to expose it. For 8 months, Catherine played the compliant victim while secretly planning her escape. She pretended to be more addicted than she was. She acted more broken than she felt. And she waited for the moment when the sisters' attention was divided. That moment came during a police raid on a competing brothel, when everyone was distracted by the drama. Catherine escaped through a second-floor window, broke her ankle in the fall, and dragged herself 6 blocks to a Catholic church. The priest who found her tried to send her back, assuming she was just another runaway prostitute. But Catherine refused to leave until someone heard her story. She spent 3 hours detailing everything she'd witnessed, every name she remembered, every death she'd seen covered up. The priest didn't want to believe her. Believing her meant acknowledging that his city's leadership was complicit in mass murder. But Catherine's details were too specific, too consistent, too impossible to dismiss as fantasy. The priest contacted a reformed journalist named Thomas Whitmore, one of the few reporters in Philadelphia who hadn't been bought off by the machine. Whitmore interviewed Catherine for 6 hours, checking every detail he could verify. The girl's memory was flawless. Her timeline was consistent. Her descriptions matched public records. Either she was telling the truth or she was the most sophisticated liar he'd ever encountered. Whitmore chose to believe her. And that choice brought down an empire. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy so deep it threatened to collapse Philadelphia's entire political structure. Whitmore published his initial story in November 1910, and the city's establishment tried to bury it immediately. The paper's advertisers threatened to pull their money. City officials threatened to revoke the newspaper's business license. The police captain who patronized the house showed up at Whitmore's home with thinly veiled threats. But Whitmore had done something brilliant. He'd sent copies of all his evidence to newspapers in New York, Boston, and Washington before publishing locally. If anything happened to him or if the story was suppressed in Philadelphia, it would explode nationally. The sisters couldn't murder their way out of this one. The conspiracy was too exposed. Too many people knew. So they tried a different strategy. They tried to destroy Catherine Walsh's credibility. They claimed she was insane, addicted, vengeful, a prostitute trying to extort money. They deployed every weapon society uses to discredit women who speak uncomfortable truths. And for a few weeks it almost worked. But then the bodies started surfacing. The private cemetery the sisters owned was investigated, and what authorities found confirmed Catherine's worst testimonies. 73 unmarked graves. Some contained remains showing evidence of arsenic poisoning. Others showed signs of violence the sisters hadn't mentioned in their ledgers. The forensic evidence was undeniable. The Everhart house wasn't just a brothel where some women died. It was a systematic killing operation that had operated for over a decade with full knowledge of the city's power structure. The arrests came in January 1911. Not just the sisters, but 16 city officials, including the police captain, 2 judges, and 5 councilmen. The trial became a national scandal, exposing not just individual crimes but an entire system of corruption. The Everhart sisters were sentenced to hang. They never expressed remorse. At their sentencing, Lila's only statement was that they'd done what was necessary to survive in a world that gave women no other options. Margot said nothing at all. They were executed in March 1911, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the same cemetery as their victims. Now here's where most people stop thinking about this story, satisfied that justice was served. But justice wasn't served. Justice would have been preventing these murders in the first place. Justice would have been a society that didn't create conditions where women had to choose between starvation and exploitation. What happened was punishment, which is different from justice. Punishment is what systems apply to individuals who expose the system's failures. The Everhart sisters were punished, but the system that created them continued unchanged. The men who patronized the house mostly escaped prosecution. The economic conditions that funneled desperate women into sexual slavery remained intact. The legal structures that made certain lives disposable were never reformed. Within 5 years of the Everhart executions, similar operations were running in Pittsburgh, Baltimore, and New York. Different names. Same model. Same body count. Because the real problem was never the Everhart sisters. They were symptoms. The disease was a social order that commodified women's bodies and then punished women for navigating that commodification however they could. Let's talk about what this story reveals about power and who gets to define evil. The Everhart sisters are remembered as monsters. But the men who created the market demand for their services are barely footnotes in history. The politicians who enabled them are anonymous. The police who took bribes to look away are unnamed. The system that funneled desperate women into exploitation is never questioned. This is how power protects itself, by ensuring that consequences flow downward, never upward. The sisters were working-class women who clawed their way to power through the only avenue available to them. When they used that power monstrously, they were destroyed. But the upper-class men who used their power just as monstrously, who created and sustained the market for human trafficking, who knew about the murders and did nothing, they died in their beds surrounded by families who revered them. Their names are on buildings. Their legacies are protected. This isn't justice. This is class warfare disguised as moral righteousness. The Everhart sisters absolutely deserved punishment for their crimes. But so did everyone who made those crimes possible, profitable, and invisible. What makes this story truly disturbing isn't the murder count. 73 dead women is a tragedy, but it's a statistically small tragedy compared to the systemic violence that kills thousands of women annually through poverty, lack of healthcare, and intimate partner violence. What makes this story disturbing is what it reveals about how societies organize mass death through bureaucratic indifference. The Everhart murders happened because dozens of people made individual decisions to prioritize their own comfort over vulnerable lives. Not one of those decisions felt like enabling murder. Each felt like a small compromise, a minor moral convenience. The police captain thought he was just enjoying a night out. The judge thought he was just networking. The undertaker thought he was just doing his job. But those small compromises added up to an infrastructure of death. This is the real lesson. Evil doesn't require evil people. It just requires enough people willing to make small moral compromises. Enough people willing to look away. Enough people who prioritize their immediate interests over uncomfortable truths. The Everhart sisters were efficient killers, but they were enabled by something far more dangerous: collective indifference. Now we need to examine why this story was buried so effectively that most people have never heard it. The trial was national news in 1911. For 6 months, it was the biggest story in America. Then it disappeared from public consciousness within a year. Why? Because the people in power wanted it disappeared. The trial had exposed too much corruption, implicated too many important families, revealed too much about how the system actually functioned. So it was memory holed through a coordinated campaign of silence. Newspapers stopped covering it. Historians omitted it from city records. The official Philadelphia history published in 1920 mentioned the Everhart case in a single paragraph, describing it as an unfortunate incident involving unstable women. The cemetery where the victims were buried was sold to developers and paved over in 1923. No memorial was ever erected. The house on Locust Street was demolished in 1915. Every physical trace of the crimes was systematically erased. This is how inconvenient history disappears, not through dramatic book burnings, but through quiet editorial decisions by people who decide what's worth remembering. This pattern of erasure tells us something crucial about how power shapes historical narrative. We remember what the powerful want us to remember. We forget what makes them uncomfortable. The Everhart murders made everyone uncomfortable because they revealed that respectable society was built on the bones of disposable women. That revelation threatened the entire social order's claim to moral legitimacy, so it had to be forgotten. But here's what they couldn't erase: the pattern. The Everhart operation wasn't unique. It was just one of the few that got caught. In the early 1900s, similar operations existed in every major American city. The Chicago Vice Commission estimated in 1910 that over 5,000 women were being held in sexual slavery across Illinois alone. Most were immigrants. Most spoke little English. Most disappeared without trace. How many of them were murdered? We'll never know because nobody bothered to count. The Everhart sisters killed 73 women in 13 years. How many did the system kill in that same period through neglect, exploitation, and deliberate erasure? Thousands. Tens of thousands. But we don't talk about that. Here's where we need to get uncomfortable with ourselves. It's easy to look back at 1910 and judge those people as morally inferior. It's comforting to believe we'd have been different, that we'd have spoken up, that we'd have cared. But would we? Look at what we ignore today. Look at the systems of exploitation we participate in while telling ourselves we're good people. We wear clothes made by women in sweatshops who work 16-hour days for starvation wages. We buy products made by children in countries we can't locate on a map. We know that our consumption is built on suffering, and we choose comfort over confrontation. The same moral calculus that let Philadelphia's elite ignore the Everhart murders is the same calculation we make every day. We're not different from them. We're just better at rationalizing our complicity. The real horror of the Everhart story isn't that it happened then. It's that versions of it are happening now and we're choosing the same blindness as those 1910 customers. Different century. Same silence. Same priority of personal comfort over uncomfortable truth. This is the pattern that never changes. Let me tell you about the one person who actually learned from this. Catherine Walsh, the woman who exposed the murders, never recovered from what she witnessed. She testified at trial, her testimony convicted the sisters, and she was immediately abandoned by the reform movement that had celebrated her courage. Nobody wanted to employ a former prostitute, even one who'd been enslaved. Nobody wanted to associate with someone who reminded them of uncomfortable truths. Catherine spent the rest of her life in poverty, working as a cleaning woman, dying in 1947 in a public ward. She never married. She never had children. She gave her life to expose evil, and society thanked her by making her invisible. But before she died, she wrote a memoir that was never published. The manuscript survived in a church archive, and it's one of the most devastating documents I've ever read. In it, Catherine writes that the worst part wasn't the abuse she suffered. It was the realization that the people who could have stopped it chose not to. That the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. That her suffering served a purpose. It maintained a social order where some people matter and some people don't. Catherine wrote that the Everhart sisters taught her something about human nature that she wished she'd never learned. They taught her that people are capable of anything when they stop seeing other people as human. The sisters didn't wake up one day and decide to be murderers. They took small steps down a path of dehumanization. First they saw women as products, then as problems, then as disposable. Each step was logical within their moral framework. Each step was justified by necessity. By the time they reached murder, it felt like just another business decision. Catherine realized this wasn't unique to the sisters. This was how every atrocity in history happened. Small steps. Gradual dehumanization. Rational justifications for irrational evil. She realized that the scariest thing about monsters isn't that they're different from us. It's that they're exactly like us, just further down a path we all walk to some degree. The only difference between the Everhart sisters and the rest of us is that they stopped pretending. They stopped maintaining the fiction that we're all equal, that all lives matter, that the system serves everyone fairly. They acknowledged the truth and weaponized it. Now let's talk about the control mechanisms the sisters used, because they're more sophisticated than you'd expect. The laudanum addiction was obvious, but it was just one tool. More powerful was the psychological conditioning they employed. New arrivals were subjected to a process that broke down their identity and rebuilt it around dependency. First came isolation from their old lives. Any letters they wrote were read and often destroyed. Any visitors were turned away. Then came the creation of artificial family bonds within the house. The sisters positioned themselves as mother figures, the only people who understood and cared for the women. This created traumatic bonding, where victims develop attachment to their abusers. Then came the systematic destruction of self-worth. Women were told constantly that they were worthless outside the house, that no one wanted them, that they were lucky to have a place there. This conditioning made escape psychologically impossible even when it was physically possible. The sisters understood that the strongest chains are mental. They understood that if you convince someone they're powerless, you don't need locks. This wasn't intuitive evil. This was studied. The sisters had observed how cults functioned, how military training broke down individuals, how slavery had operated. They synthesized those techniques into their own system of psychological domination. The financial control was equally sophisticated. The sisters operated on a system of perpetual debt that would make modern credit card companies proud. Women were charged for everything: their room, their food, their medical care, their clothes, even the makeup they wore. But here's the key: they were never told the prices up front. They'd work for weeks thinking they were earning money, then be presented with a bill that exceeded everything they'd made. The prices were arbitrary, adjusted to ensure women could never get ahead. Made too much money one week? The rent would mysteriously increase. Getting close to paying off debt? Suddenly there'd be a medical emergency requiring expensive treatment. The sisters understood that hope is a more effective prison than despair. If women thought they could eventually earn their freedom, they'd work harder and resist less. So the sisters maintained the illusion of possible escape while ensuring it remained forever out of reach. This is the same mechanism used by debt peonage, by predatory lending, by any system designed to trap people in cycles of perpetual obligation. The Everhart sisters didn't invent this. They just applied it with exceptional ruthlessness. Let's examine the moment each woman realized she was going to die, because this is where the true horror lives. Imagine the progression. You arrive desperate but hopeful. The first weeks seem okay, maybe even good compared to the streets. Then the debts pile up. Then the addiction sets in. Then you realize the doors are locked and no one's coming to save you. Then you watch other women disappear and suspect but can't prove where they're going. Then one day the sisters smile and tell you you're being promoted. You're taken to the 3rd floor. The door locks behind you. And you understand with absolute clarity that you're never leaving. That moment of realization, repeated 73 times over 13 years, is the real crime. Not just the deaths but the knowing. The awareness that you'd been marked for elimination and there was nothing you could do about it. Some of the women accepted it. Some fought. Some begged. None of it mattered. The sisters had made their decision, and the machinery of death ground forward regardless. This is what institutional evil does. It removes individual agency from the equation. It doesn't matter if you're good or bad, compliant or resistant. Once you're marked by the system, the outcome is predetermined. The sisters justified their murders with logic that should sound familiar to anyone paying attention to modern economic rationalization. They argued, in private conversations recorded by investigators, that they were actually being merciful. That the women they killed were already destroyed by addiction and trauma. That they were providing a service by ending suffering that would have dragged on for years. That they were no different from doctors who administer morphine to terminal patients. This is the rhetoric of eugenics dressed up as compassion. This is how people convince themselves that murder is kindness. The sisters genuinely believed they were problem solvers dealing with human waste that society had already discarded. They saw themselves as pragmatists in a world of hypocrites who wanted to pretend disposable people didn't exist. And here's the disturbing part. Within their moral framework, they were right. Society had already decided these women didn't matter. The sisters just acted on that decision explicitly rather than hiding behind institutional neglect. They were guilty of honesty more than cruelty. They were guilty of doing openly what society does quietly every day, deciding which lives have value and which don't. After the trial, a journalist named Margaret Doyle investigated what happened to the survivors, the women who'd been in the house but escaped before being murdered. She tracked down 17 of them. Only 2 agreed to speak with her. Both had attempted suicide multiple times. Both were unemployable because of their association with the house. Both were addicted to drugs they'd been given during their captivity. Both said explicitly that death would have been better than survival because survival meant carrying the memory of what they'd witnessed and being punished for it anyway. This is the part of the story that never gets told. The survivors weren't rescued. They were condemned to living death, ostracized by the same society that had created the conditions for their exploitation. One of them told Doyle, "The Everhart sisters killed me too, they just didn't bury my body." The other said, "At least the dead ones got to stop hurting." These women didn't get justice. They got a lifetime of trauma and social death. This is what we mean when we talk about systems of violence. The violence doesn't end when the immediate abuse stops. It echoes through entire lives, destroying futures, crushing hope, making recovery impossible. Now here's the part where I ask you to do something. If this story has reached you, if you're understanding what I'm really saying here, I want you to comment one phrase twice. Type it once for the women who died. Type it again for the survivors who carried their stories. The phrase is, "I see the pattern." Comment it twice. Let it lock into your consciousness. Let it mark the moment you stop pretending not to know. Because this isn't just history. This is a blueprint. The Everhart sisters used debt, addiction, isolation, legal corruption, and social indifference to commit mass murder. Look at modern systems of exploitation and tell me which of those elements has disappeared. Look at human trafficking networks operating globally today. Look at private prisons that profit from captive labor. Look at pharmaceutical companies that create addicts to create customers. Look at ICE detention centers where women disappear. Look at psychiatric hospitals that warehouse inconvenient people. The mechanisms the Everhart sisters used aren't historical artifacts. They're current operating procedures. So comment it, "I see the pattern." Let the algorithm register that you're awake. Let yourself register that you can't unsee this now. The pattern isn't just about institutional evil. It's about how we, as individuals, navigate our complicity in that evil. Every person who patronized the Everhart house made a choice to prioritize their pleasure over another person's humanity. They didn't think of it that way, of course. They thought of it as a transaction, as business, as just how things work. This is how mass atrocity always functions, through millions of individual decisions that seem small in isolation but add up to systematic horror. You can't understand the Everhart murders without understanding that every customer was a collaborator. Every official who took a bribe was an accomplice. Every newspaper that didn't investigate was complicit. And everyone who knew something was wrong but said nothing because it wasn't their problem was guilty of the silence that makes murder possible. This isn't about collective guilt as an abstraction. It's about recognizing that systems of oppression don't run on their own. They run because people like us make daily decisions to participate in or ignore them. The Everhart sisters couldn't have killed anyone without a society willing to look away. Let's discuss the economics that made the Everhart operation profitable, because profit motives explain more than psychology ever could. A woman working voluntarily as a prostitute in 1900 Philadelphia could earn enough to live independently if she avoided addiction and violence. She had options, limited but real. A woman in debt bondage at the Everhart house generated significantly more profit because she couldn't leave, couldn't negotiate terms, couldn't keep any earnings beyond subsistence. The sisters didn't just run a brothel, they ran a labor camp where the labor was sexual and the end of productivity meant death. This is capitalism without the pretense of consent. This is what markets look like when humans are treated as commodities instead of participants. The sisters maximized profit through vertical integration. They controlled housing, food, drugs, medical care, and disposal. Every aspect of their victims' existence generated revenue. Even death was profitable because it eliminated overhead for non-productive assets. This business model wasn't unique. It's the same model used by slaveholders, by prison labor systems, by any operation that extracts maximum value from captive populations. The Everhart sisters were entrepreneurs in an industry built on human commodification. The medical establishment's complicity deserves special attention. The coroner who signed off on dozens of suspicious deaths wasn't incompetent. He was paid. The doctors who treated the women in the house knew they were being poisoned. The pharmacists who filled massive orders for laudanum and arsenic knew those quantities weren't for legitimate medical use. Every medical professional who touched this operation made a conscious choice to prioritize money over ethics. This is what happens when healthcare operates as a business rather than a social service. When profit becomes the priority, patient welfare becomes negotiable. The doctors who enabled the Everhart murders weren't monsters. They were professionals making business decisions within a system that rewarded compliance and punished whistleblowing. This pattern continues today. Pharmaceutical companies that pushed opioids knew they were creating addicts. Doctors who overprescribe know they're causing harm. Insurance companies that deny life-saving treatment know they're killing people. The Everhart doctors seem obviously evil in retrospect, but they were operating according to the same incentive structures that govern modern medical systems. The only difference is better public relations. The religious institution's failure is equally revealing. Multiple churches were within blocks of the Everhart house. Multiple priests and ministers heard confessions from men who patronized it. Not one religious leader called for investigation until Catherine Walsh literally dragged herself to their door bleeding. Why? Because investigating would have meant confronting their own congregations, their own donors, their own members who were complicit. This is the eternal compromise of institutional religion. It claims to serve moral truth but actually serves institutional survival. When truth threatens the institution, truth gets sacrificed. The Catholic Church knew about the Everhart operation. The Protestant denominations knew. The synagogues knew. They all chose silence over scandal. They chose protecting their reputation over protecting vulnerable women. This isn't unique to 1910. This is the same calculation that let religious institutions ignore or cover up sexual abuse for decades. The same calculation that lets them maintain massive wealth while their communities starve. The pattern is simple. Institutions prioritize institutional survival over stated values. Always. The Everhart case is just one more data point in an eternal pattern of moral cowardice dressed up as pastoral wisdom. Now we examine what happened to the city after the sisters were executed. Philadelphia's power structure claimed the trial had cleansed the city, that justice had been served, that reforms would prevent future abuses. Within 3 years, the same networks were operating under new management. The same police captains were taking the same bribes. The same politicians were protecting the same interests. The same dynamics that created the Everhart operation were creating new operations with new names. Because the trial had punished individuals without changing systems. It had removed symptoms without treating the disease. This is what performative justice always accomplishes. It lets society feel virtuous without actually transforming anything fundamental. The people wanted to believe that hanging the Everhart sisters solved the problem. It didn't. It just drove the problem underground where it was harder to see but no less deadly. Real justice would have required admitting that the entire social order was designed to create Everhart-style operations. That poverty, legal inequality, and social indifference weren't bugs in the system but features. That protecting vulnerable people required dismantling power structures, not just punishing individual bad actors. That conversation never happened. So the cycle continued. The legacy of the Everhart murders is written in every modern instance of systematic exploitation that we choose not to see. It's written in human trafficking networks that operate in every major city. It's written in agricultural labor camps where workers are held in debt bondage. It's written in immigrant detention centers where people disappear. It's written in the prison industrial complex that turns human suffering into profit. The mechanism is always the same. Identify a vulnerable population, create conditions where they're isolated from social support, extract maximum value from their labor or bodies, dispose of them when they're no longer profitable. The Everhart sisters pioneered this model in the context of sexual exploitation, but it's been applied across every industry where human beings can be converted into commodities. We act shocked when these operations are exposed, as if they're aberrations rather than inevitable products of systems that prioritize profit over humanity. We prosecute individual operators while leaving the market structures that incentivize their operations completely intact. Then we're surprised when new operations spring up to fill the gap. The Everhart story isn't historical. It's a template that keeps repeating because we refuse to learn the actual lesson. The lesson isn't that some people are evil. That's the comfortable takeaway that lets us feel superior without changing anything. The lesson is that systems create evil by making it profitable and punishing resistance. The Everhart sisters didn't invent sexual slavery. They just optimized it for their market conditions. The men who patronized them didn't invent the commodification of women's bodies. They just participated in the market that was offered to them. The officials who enabled them didn't invent corruption. They just responded to the incentive structures they operated within. Everyone was following the logic of the system they inhabited. This is what makes systematic evil so difficult to combat. You can't just remove bad people because the system produces new bad people to replace them. You have to change the system itself, which means threatening the interests of everyone who benefits from the current arrangement. The Everhart trial threatened those interests momentarily, created panic among Philadelphia's elite, then was contained and memory hold. The system survived by sacrificing 2 women who'd become liabilities while protecting everyone else who'd been complicit. Catherine Walsh understood this, which is why her memoir is so devastating. She wrote that exposing the Everhart sisters accomplished nothing except making her a pariah. She wrote that the real criminals, the men who created and sustained the market for sexual slavery, went unpunished because punishing them would have required society to admit its own guilt. She wrote that the only reason anyone cared about the Everhart murders is because they became too visible to ignore, not because society suddenly developed a conscience. She wrote that if the sisters had been more careful, if they'd disposed of bodies more effectively, if they'd maintained better relationships with their protectors, they could have operated indefinitely. She wrote that the difference between successful and failed evil isn't morality, it's competence. The Everhart sisters failed not because they were uniquely wicked but because they were sloppy. They left evidence. They made enemies. They became inconvenient. More competent operators learned from their mistakes. Modern trafficking networks have better disposal methods, better legal protection, better public relations. The operation continues. You just got better at hiding. So what do you do with this information? How do you live with the knowledge that the mechanisms that enabled the Everhart murders are still operating, just with better branding? You have 3 options. First option, forget it. Decide this is too dark, too uncomfortable, too big to confront. Go back to the comfortable illusion that systems basically work and injustice is an aberration. Most people choose this option. It's the easiest. Second option, acknowledge it but claim powerlessness. Say yes, the system is broken, but what can one person do? Use awareness as a badge of sophisticated cynicism rather than a call to action. Lots of people choose this option. It lets you feel smart without risking anything. Third option, let this knowledge change how you operate. Look for the Everhart patterns in your own life. Where are you participating in systems of exploitation? Where are you benefiting from someone else's suffering? Where are you looking away because seeing would require costly changes? Then make different choices. Not grand revolutionary gestures, but daily decisions to stop feeding the machinery of systematic evil. This is the hardest option because it requires ongoing discomfort and sacrifice. But it's the only option that actually honors the memory of the 73 women who died in that house. The Everhart sisters are dead. The women they murdered are dead. The men who enabled them are dead. But the pattern lives. It lives in every system that treats humans as resources to be extracted rather than beings to be honored. It lives in every market that profits from desperation. It lives in every institution that prioritizes self-preservation over justice. And it lives in every individual choice to prioritize comfort over confrontation. You're standing at a crossroads right now. You can let this story be entertainment, a dark history lesson that you consume and forget. Or you can let it be a mirror that shows you uncomfortable truths about the world you participate in and the person you're choosing to be. The Everhart sisters taught us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary evil when systems make evil profitable and resistance costly. The customers and enablers taught us that complicity doesn't require active participation, just passive acceptance. The survivors taught us that trauma echoes across lifetimes when societies refuse to provide justice or healing. What will you teach? How will your choices ripple through the systems you touch? The pattern is clear. The only question is whether you're going to pretend not to see it, or whether you're going to be the disruption in the system that makes exploitation just a little bit harder. That's the choice. Make it count.